The following days settled into a pattern that Kira recognized from her assessment training. Vaughn and his group had identified her as a target, someone they perceived as vulnerable and beneath their status. The harassment would escalate gradually, testing boundaries and establishing dominance through increasingly aggressive interactions. Tuesday morning brought the first physical interference. Kira had spent an hour organizing equipment racks in the depot, arranging tactical gear according to unit specifications. The work was methodical and precise, exactly what her cover role demanded. She stepped back to verify the arrangement when Vaughn entered with Farrell, both in workout gear and carrying water bottles. They walked past her organized racks without apparent attention, but Vaughn's shoulder caught the edge of a carefully stacked pile of tactical vests. The equipment tumbled to the concrete floor with a series of heavy thuds, webbing and buckles scattering across the workspace. "Oh man," Vaughn said, glancing back at the mess. "That looks unstable. Should probably secure your equipment better, specialist." Safety hazard waiting to happen. Kira stood motionless for a moment, watching them continue toward the water cooler at the far end of the depot. Farrell glanced back once, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes betraying amusement. She knelt and began gathering the scattered vests, refolding each one and checking for damage. None of the equipment was compromised, but the message was clear. Her space was not protected. Her work could be disrupted without consequence. That afternoon, she delivered supplies to the training ranges. The facility maintained 3 separate ranges for different weapons qualifications, and Kira made her rounds with her usual efficiency. At the rifle range, she found trainee Corporal Isaiah Grant working through marksmanship drills under the supervision of a senior instructor. Isaiah was younger than most trainees, maybe 21, with the earnest intensity of someone determined to prove himself worthy of the SEAL community. He nodded respectfully as Kira approached with ammunition resupply, actually thanking her for the delivery. The simple courtesy stood out against the treatment she had been receiving from Vaughn's group. "How is training going?" she asked, making conversation while she logged the ammunition transfer. "Challenging," Isaiah replied, ejecting a magazine and setting his rifle on the bench. "But that is the point, right? If it was easy, everyone would make it through selection." Kira smiled slightly, appreciating the perspective. "That is the right attitude. You work supply full-time?" Isaiah asked. "For now. It is what the Navy needs me to do, so I do it." Before Isaiah could respond, Vaughn's voice carried across the range. "Grant, you making friends with support staff instead of focusing on your qualifying scores? That is a great way to wash out." Isaiah's jaw tightened, but he turned back to his rifle without answering. Kira finished her logging and moved on, noting the interaction in her mental catalog. Vaughn was not just targeting her directly, but also enforcing social isolation, making it clear that associating with her carried professional risk. Wednesday brought escalation during the communal meal period. The facility dining area was segregated by informal hierarchy, with trainees claiming territory based on their status and relationships. Kira typically ate alone at a small table near the kitchen entrance, a position that kept her peripheral to the social dynamics she was observing. She had just sat down with her tray when Poke approached, carrying his own meal. He set his tray on her table without asking, dropping into the chair across from her with casual presumption. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, the question purely rhetorical since he had already seated himself. Kira continued eating, offering no response. Poke leaned forward, his voice dropping to a tone meant to sound confidential but calculated to unsettle. "You know, some of the guys have been talking, wondering how someone like you ended up in a place like this. SEAL training facility, even in supply, that is usually reserved for people with some kind of military background. Combat experience, deployment history, something that shows you understand the mission." "I have my assignment orders," Kira replied evenly. "Same as everyone else here." Sure. But orders can come from all kinds of places. Political pressure, diversity quotas, command trying to check boxes. Makes people wonder about competence versus compliance, you know what I mean." Kira met his eyes, her expression unchanged. "I do my job. That should be all that matters. Poke smiled, but there was nothing friendly in it. Should be. But this is the SEAL community, specialist. We hold ourselves to higher standards. Cannot afford weak links when lives are on the line. He stood, picking up his tray. Just something to think about. Some people belong here. Some people are just taking up space that could go to a real warrior. The conversation was loud enough to carry to nearby tables. Several trainees glanced over, some curious, some visibly uncomfortable with the exchange. Kira returned to her meal, chewing methodically while her mind processed the tactical elements of the encounter. Poke was establishing narrative, planting doubts about her competence and legitimacy. It was psychological warfare dressed as casual conversation. That evening, Commander Reeves passed her in the corridor outside the supply depot. Their interaction was brief and professional, nothing that would suggest any relationship beyond standard command structure. But as they passed, Reeves spoke quietly without breaking stride. Documentation is solid. Continue the mission. The validation was minimal but important. Kira was not enduring this harassment for nothing. Every interaction was building a case, demonstrating patterns of behavior that needed institutional correction. She thought about Isaiah, the young trainee who had shown basic respect and then been targeted by Vaughn for that simple courtesy. How many good candidates washed out not because they lacked capability, but because toxic culture made the environment unbearable? Thursday morning brought another equipment disruption, this time more elaborate. Kira arrived at the depot to find her organized inventory sheets scattered across the floor, pages torn from her clipboard and mixed with deliberate randomness. Hours of documentation, work destroyed in what could be dismissed as accident or carelessness if reported. She spent the morning reconstructing her records from backup logs, the tedious work eating into time she should have spent on actual supply duties. Vaughn appeared near the end of her recovery effort, surveying the scene with feigned concern. Rough morning, Vaughn asked, his tone dripping with false sympathy. Organizational skills are really important in supply work. Cannot have someone who loses track of critical documentation. Kira looked up from her reconstructed inventory sheets, meeting his eyes with deliberate calm. Everything is accounted for. The records are complete. Good. Would hate for there to be any questions about your competence. You know how command gets when supply chains break down. Someone has to take responsibility. He left without waiting for a response, his message delivered. Kira returned to her work, adding another detailed entry to her mental documentation. The harassment was following a textbook pattern of workplace bullying, each incident carefully calibrated to remain just below the threshold of actionable misconduct while creating a hostile environment. The weekend brought a temporary respite as training schedules shifted and many personnel rotated off the facility. Kira used the quiet time to catch up on legitimate supply duties and prepare equipment for the following week's exercises. The depot was peaceful, just her and the familiar rhythm of inventory management and logistics planning. Monday shattered that peace. The facility was conducting a major field exercise, a 3-day evolution designed to test trainee performance under simulated combat conditions. Kira's role was supporting the exercise with equipment distribution and recovery, work that would put her in closer contact with a training cadre and participants than her usual depot isolation. She arrived at the staging area before dawn, coordinating with range safety officers and exercise controllers. The supplies were substantial: training ammunition, communication equipment, medical kits, water resupply, everything needed to sustain 24 trainees in a realistic field environment. Vaughn appeared as she was checking radio batteries. His team assembled behind him. They were scheduled to draw their equipment first, setting the tone for the entire exercise. Morning, specialist, Vaughn said, his voice carrying to the other trainees who were arriving for their own equipment draws. Hope everything is in order. Would not want any equipment failures compromising our training. Everything has been inspected and certified, Kira replied, handing him a checklist. Sign here to confirm receipt. Vaughn made a show of examining each item, turning over radios and checking ammunition counts with exaggerated care. His teammates followed his lead, creating an atmosphere of distrust and suspicion around Kira's work. Radio battery looks low, Farrell announced, holding up a unit that Kira knew was fully charged. All batteries were tested this morning, Kira said. That unit shows full charge. Maybe your testing equipment is faulty, Polk suggested. Hate to get out in the field and have communications fail because supply did not do their job properly. The implication hung in the air as other trainees watched the exchange. Kira pulled out her testing equipment and demonstrated the battery charge in front of the assembled group. The radio showed full power, exactly as she had documented. Farrell said. Guess it's working after all. Easy mistake. The word mistake echoed with deliberate emphasis, planting seeds of doubt even as the equipment proved functional. Kira continued processing equipment draws, maintaining professional efficiency while the trainees dispersed to their training positions. Isaiah approached near the end of the distribution period, his manner apologetic. Sorry about that, he said quietly. They're just trying to get under your skin. Kira handed him his equipment checklist. Nothing to apologize for. You did not do anything wrong. Still feels wrong, watching them treat you like that. You're just doing your job. We all have our roles to play, Kira said, the double meaning clear only to herself. Focus on your training. That is what matters right now. Isaiah nodded, but his expression remained troubled. He had the integrity to recognize injustice, even when intervening carried personal risk. Kira made a mental note to mention him specifically in her assessment report as an example of positive leadership potential. The field exercise consumed the next 2 days. Kira monitored from a support position, coordinating resupply runs and equipment maintenance. The trainees were pushed hard, moving through scenarios that tested their physical endurance, tactical decision-making, and team cohesion under pressure. On the second day, Vaughn's team encountered a simulated ambush scenario. From her position at the support station, Kira monitored the exercise through radio traffic and observer reports. The scenario was designed to evaluate leadership under stress, with Vaughn responsible for tactical decisions and team safety. The reports that came back were concerning. Vaughn had made several questionable calls, prioritizing aggressive action over team security. 2 of his teammates sustained minor injuries during a hasty assault that exercise controllers deemed unnecessary and tactically unsound. The injuries were not serious, but they revealed leadership failures that could prove catastrophic in actual combat. That evening, as trainees returned to base for recovery and equipment maintenance, Kira overheard conversations that confirmed her observations. Several trainees were quietly discussing Vaughn's decisions, expressing concerns about his judgment and willingness to risk team safety for personal glory. But when the formal debrief occurred, those concerns evaporated. Vaughn controlled the narrative, framing his aggressive tactics as bold leadership and dismissing the injuries as acceptable costs of realistic training. His teammates, either loyal or intimidated, backed his version of events. The exercise controllers noted the concerns but took no immediate action. Kira was processing returned equipment when Vaughn approached, his expression stormy. She recognized the look immediately, the dangerous combination of embarrassment and anger that came from having one's competence questioned. Heard some equipment failed during the exercise, he said, his voice tight. Communication gear cutting out at critical moments. That is a pretty serious problem, specialist. All equipment was tested before issue, Kira replied. If you experience technical difficulties, I will need to inspect the units to determine the cause. Maybe the cause is incompetent supply personnel who do not know how to maintain equipment properly. The accusation was direct enough to demand response. Kira set down her inventory tablet and faced him fully. All equipment issued for this exercise was certified operational. If specific units malfunctioned, standard procedure is to document the failure and return the equipment for technical evaluation. Did you document any equipment failures during the exercise? Vaughn's jaw worked as he processed the professional challenge. Documentation would create a paper trail that could be investigated, potentially revealing that his communication problems stemmed from tactical mistakes rather than equipment failure. Equipment worked fine, Vaughn finally said, his tone dismissive. Just making conversation about the importance of proper maintenance. He walked away before Kira could respond, leaving her with the clear understanding that he had been testing whether she would challenge him directly. She had, and now he knew she would not simply accept blame for failures that were not hers. That knowledge would shape his future approach. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Commander Reeves announced a facility-wide physical training session, a quarterly tradition designed to maintain unit cohesion and demonstrate that leadership met the same standards as trainees. All personnel were required to participate, including support staff. Kira understood immediately what this meant. Her cover required her to perform at average levels, nothing that would suggest the elite conditioning of an active SEAL operator. But Vaughn would use this opportunity to publicly demonstrate her supposed inadequacy, reinforcing his narrative about her lack of belonging in the military community. The formation assembled at dawn, roughly 60 personnel ranging from senior instructors to the newest trainees. Commander Reeves stood at the front, his bearing reflecting decades of military service and continued physical excellence. 5-mile run, standard pace, he announced. Fall out in formation. Support personnel integrate with your assigned sections. Kira found herself positioned near the middle of the formation, surrounded by trainees who regarded her with varying degrees of curiosity and skepticism. Vaughn was several rows ahead, but she could feel his attention even without seeing his face. The formation moved out, settling into the grinding rhythm of a military formation run. The pace was challenging but sustainable, designed to test endurance rather than speed. Kira matched the stride of the runners around her, maintaining position without apparent effort, but also without displaying any particular athletic ability. 3 miles in, as the formation stretched and some runners began struggling, Vaughn dropped back through the ranks. He moved with deliberate ease, demonstrating his superior conditioning as he navigated past slower runners. When he reached Kira's position, he matched her pace. Keeping up okay, specialist, he asked, his breathing still controlled despite the sustained effort. I am fine, Kira replied, her own breathing steady but not suspiciously easy. Good. Would hate to see someone fall out. That would be pretty embarrassing, especially for support personnel. Sets a bad example for the trainees, you know. Makes them wonder about standards. He accelerated away, leaving the comment hanging in the air. Several nearby trainees glanced at Kira, evaluating her response and performance. She maintained her steady pace, neither speeding up to match Vaughn nor slowing down to validate his implications. The formation completed the 5 miles and moved directly into calisthenics. Push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups, the standard battery of exercises that measured basic military fitness. Kira performed each evolution at competent but unremarkable levels, hitting minimum standards without exceeding them. During pull-ups, Vaughn positioned himself at the bar next to hers. He completed 25 repetitions with textbook form, his performance drawing approving nods from the observing instructors. Kira completed 12, the minimum passing standard for her supposed age and gender category. 12, Vaughn announced loudly as she dropped from the bar. That is passing, technically, but barely. Most SEALs would do that warm-up before their actual workout. The comparison was deliberate and public. Several trainees laughed, though Isaiah and a few others looked uncomfortable with the open mockery. Commander Reeves observed from his position with the senior staff, but made no intervention. Kira understood that he was allowing the situation to develop, gathering evidence of the toxic culture through direct observation. The training session concluded with a formation run back to the facility. Kira maintained her position throughout, finishing with the main body of runners, but clearly not among the top performers. It was exactly the showing her cover required, but Vaughn had successfully used it to reinforce his narrative about her inadequacy. In the days that followed, the story of her performance circulated through the facility. Vaughn and his allies made sure everyone heard about the support specialist who barely met minimum standards, questioning aloud how someone so marginally qualified ended up at a SEAL training facility. The whispers followed Kira through the depot, the dining facility, every shared space on base. She documented everything, noting not just the direct harassment, but the way it shaped facility culture. Trainees who might have been neutral began avoiding her, not wanting to associate with someone marked as inferior. The isolation intensified, creating exactly the kind of hostile environment that drove good people away from military service. Isaiah remained one of the few who still acknowledged her with basic courtesy. One afternoon, as she was delivering supplies to the training ranges, he approached with visible hesitation. "Can I ask you something?" he said, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "Of course. Why do you stay? I mean, they make it pretty clear you are not welcome here. Why not request a transfer? Go somewhere you would be treated with basic respect." Kira considered her response carefully. Because sometimes the right thing to do is stay and do your job, regardless of how people treat you. Running away does not fix broken systems. It just leaves them broken for the next person. Isaiah absorbed this, his expression thoughtful. "That is pretty brave. Most people would have quit by now." "Bravery is relative," Kira replied. "You are still here too, even after they targeted you for treating me like a human being. That takes courage. I just try to do what is right. Then you're already ahead of most people." The conversation stayed with Kira as she continued her rounds. Isaiah represented what the SEAL community was supposed to be: integrity, courage, commitment to values over social pressure. But Vaughn represented the cancer that could destroy that culture from within, the toxic leadership that prioritized personal status over team welfare. That evening, as Kira was securing the depot for the night, her radio crackled with an unexpected message. Commander Reeves requesting her presence at his office, after hours and away from normal facility traffic. She locked the depot and made her way across the compound, moving through the lengthening shadows of late afternoon. The commander's office was austere, decorated only with commendations and unit photographs spanning a career of distinguished service. Reeve gestured for her to close the door and take a seat. "Your documentation has been thorough," he said without preamble. "We have more than enough evidence of the behavioral patterns you were sent to identify. The question now is how we proceed to resolution." Kira sat across from Commander Reeves, her posture professional but her mind racing through tactical considerations. The assessment had reached a critical juncture, the point where documentation transitioned into action. "The pattern is clear," Kira said. "Systematic harassment targeting perceived vulnerability, social isolation tactics, deliberate sabotage of work product, and public humiliation designed to force resignation. Trainee Sergeant Vaughn is the primary actor, but he has enablers throughout the trainee population. More concerning is the passive acceptance by some instructors who witness the behavior without intervention." Reeves nodded, his expression grim. "I have observed the same patterns. The question is whether we have seen the full extent of the problem or if escalation is likely." "Based on behavioral analysis, escalation is almost certain," Kira replied. "Vaughn has established dominance through psychological means, but those tactics have limitations. If I remain in position without breaking, he will need to escalate to maintain his status among his peer group. The harassment will become more aggressive, possibly physical." "That brings us to the decision point," Reeves said. "We can conclude the assessment now with the evidence gathered, or we can allow the situation to develop further. Both options carry risks." Kira understood the implications immediately. Concluding now would address the documented problems, but might miss deeper systemic issues. Allowing escalation could reveal the full extent of the toxic culture, but would require her to endure increasingly severe harassment. "What is your recommendation, Commander?" Reeves met her eyes with the directness of a fellow SEAL operator. "This is your mission, Lieutenant. I will support whatever decision you make. But I need to know you are choosing with full understanding of the potential consequences." The use of her actual rank, spoken privately in this secure office, reminded Kira of who she really was beneath the cover identity. Not a vulnerable support specialist, but a combat veteran with years of experience in high-risk operations. This was just another mission, albeit one that tested different skills than direct action. "I recommend we continue," Kira said. The evidence we have documents surface behaviors, but I believe there are deeper problems with unit culture and leadership accountability. If we can identify the breaking point, where harassment crosses into assault, we can implement more comprehensive reforms. Understood. I will continue to monitor from my position. But Lieutenant, if at any point you need to break cover for your own safety, you have my authorization to do so. Acknowledged, sir. Kira left the commander's office as the sun set over the facility, her decision made. The mission would continue until they had documented the full scope of the problem. She returned to her quarters, a small room in the support staff barracks, and prepared for what she knew was coming. The next day confirmed her tactical assessment. Vaughn's behavior shifted noticeably, his harassment becoming more aggressive and personal. During the morning equipment distribution, he deliberately bumped into her while reaching for ammunition crates, the contact hard enough to stagger her back a step. "Watch where you're standing, specialist," he said, his voice loud enough for the assembled trainees to hear. "Supply area gets crowded. Cannot have people getting in the way of operational personnel." The physical contact crossed the line, moving from verbal harassment into physical intimidation. Kira noted the escalation mentally while maintaining her composed exterior. Several trainees watched the interaction with discomfort, but none intervened. That afternoon, Vaughn appeared at the depot with Polk and Farrell, ostensibly to return equipment from a completed training evolution. But their purpose became clear as they deliberately created chaos in her workspace, dropping gear carelessly and scattering her organized inventory. "Seems like supply is having trouble keeping things organized," Vaughn observed, surveying the disruption. "Maybe the job is too complicated for current personnel. Should probably report this to command. Recommend getting someone more competent in here." Kira began gathering the scattered equipment, her movements methodical despite the provocation. "All returned equipment will be inspected and logged," she said. "If there are concerns about supply operations, standard procedure is to submit a formal report through the chain of command." "Oh, I will file reports," Vaughn replied. "Count on that. Going to document every failure, every mistake, every indication that you are not qualified for this position." He stepped closer, invading her personal space in a manner that was clearly deliberate. "You do not belong here," he said, his voice dropping to a tone meant only for her. "Everyone knows it. Everyone sees it. Only a matter of time before command figures it out and sends you somewhere more appropriate. Maybe a recruiting station desk job, something that does not require actual military competence." Kira held her position, refusing to step back despite the intimidation. "I have my orders, and I will continue executing them to the best of my ability." "Your best is not good enough," Vaughn said. "That is the problem." He left with his group, their laughter echoing through the depot. Kira stood among the scattered equipment, assessing the situation tactically. The harassment had escalated to physical intimidation and explicit threats. Vaughn was approaching the breaking point where he would need to back up his dominance claims with actual force. The following days brought increased pressure. Vaughn made a point of confronting her in public spaces, always with witnesses, always pushing boundaries without quite crossing into actionable assault. He spread rumors about her competence, suggesting to other trainees and even some instructors that her work was substandard and potentially dangerous. Isaiah approached her one evening as she was closing the depot, his expression troubled. "They are planning something," he said quietly. "I overheard Vaughn and his guys talking. They want to push you into quitting or getting you reassigned. I think they are going to try to sabotage something major, make it look like your fault." Kira absorbed this information, grateful for the warning, but knowing she could not act on it without compromising her mission. "Thank you for telling me. I will be careful. You should report this to Commander Reeves," Isaiah insisted. "This has gone too far. I appreciate your concern, but I can handle the situation." Isaiah looked frustrated, but respected her decision. "Just be careful. These guys play for keeps, and they do not care who they hurt." After he left, Kira considered the intelligence. Vaughn was planning active sabotage, something significant enough to justify her removal from the facility. That level of escalation suggested he felt threatened by her continued presence. that her refusal to break or resign challenged his authority in ways he could not tolerate. She spent the evening double-checking her equipment inventories, verifying every serial number and maintenance record. Whatever Vaughn was planning, she would not give him legitimate ammunition for his accusations. The sabotage came 3 days later, more sophisticated than Kira had anticipated. She arrived at the depot for her morning routine and immediately noticed something wrong. The ammunition locker showed signs of tampering, the seal broken and the door slightly ajar. Her training kicked in automatically. She did not touch the locker, but instead photographed the scene with her issued tablet, documenting every detail before investigating further. When she finally opened the door, her suspicions were confirmed. Someone had accessed the locker overnight and deliberately miscounted ammunition, creating a discrepancy that would appear as though she had failed to properly secure and track control materials. It was elegant in its simplicity. Ammunition accountability was sacred in military operations, and any shortage or discrepancy triggered immediate investigation. If Kira could not account for the missing rounds, she would face serious professional consequences, potentially including criminal charges for the loss of military ordnance. But whoever had staged the sabotage had made a critical error. They had not realized that Kira maintained redundant inventory systems, documenting serial numbers and lot codes beyond what standard procedures required. Her backup records would prove that the ammunition had been properly secured and that the discrepancy was created after hours, when she had no access to the facility. She reported the discrepancy immediately, following proper protocol and notifying both her direct supervisor and Commander Reeves. The facility lockdown was instantaneous, with security personnel securing all ammunition storage and beginning a comprehensive investigation. Vaughn appeared during the investigation, his expression carefully arranged to suggest concern rather than satisfaction. "Heard there was a security incident," he said, positioning himself where other personnel could hear. "Pretty serious thing, losing accountability of live ammunition. That is a career-ending mistake." "The investigation is ongoing," Kira replied, her voice professionally neutral. "Until it is complete, I would appreciate it if you would let the authorities do their work. Just saying, seems like a pattern. Equipment problems during field exercises, organizational issues with inventory, now missing ammunition. Makes you wonder about competence levels." The implication hung in the air as security personnel continued their work. But Kira noticed Commander Reeves watching from nearby, his attention focused and his expression unreadable. She knew he understood what was happening, that this was exactly the kind of escalation they had anticipated. The investigation took 6 hours. Security reviewed access logs, examined physical evidence, and cross-referenced Kira's documentation with facility records. When the lead investigator emerged from the depot, his expression was grim, but his focus was not on Kira. "The ammunition is accounted for," he announced. "Someone accessed the locker after hours using an unauthorized key and deliberately created a false discrepancy. We have footage from the exterior security camera showing 3 individuals approaching the depot at 0-100 hours. The facility held its collective breath as the investigator continued. "The individuals have been identified from the footage. Trainee Sergeant Vaughn, Trainee Polk, and Trainee Farrell. They're being detained for questioning." Kira watched Vaughn's face transform from confident superiority to shocked disbelief. He had not known about the exterior security camera, had believed the depot was unwatched during off hours. His attempt to destroy her career had instead provided ironclad evidence of his own misconduct. "That is insane," Vaughn said, his voice rising. "We were not anywhere near the depot last night. This is obviously a setup, someone trying to frame us, because they cannot handle legitimate criticism." "The footage is time-stamped and clear," the investigator replied. "You will have opportunity to present your defense during the formal inquiry. Until then, you are confined to quarters pending investigation." Security personnel escorted Vaughn and his group away, their protests fading as they disappeared toward the administrative building. The trainees who had witnessed the confrontation stood in stunned silence, the sudden reversal of fortune too dramatic to process immediately. Isaiah approached Kira as the crowd dispersed, his relief visible. "I was worried they would find a way to blame you," he said quietly. "Glad the truth came out." "The evidence spoke for itself," Kira replied. "That is what matters in the end." But internally, she knew the mission had reached a critical juncture. The sabotage attempt had failed, but it had also forced the situation into official channels before she had documented the full scope of the toxic culture. Vaughn would face consequences for the ammunition incident, but the deeper problems of harassment and systemic bullying might be overshadowed by the more dramatic criminal investigation. That evening, Commander Reeves summoned her again to his office. His expression was carefully neutral as she entered. "The ammunition incident changes the tactical situation," he said without preamble. "We now have criminal charges pending against Vaughn and his associates that will proceed through the military justice system regardless of your assessment findings." "Yes, sir," Kira agreed. "But the criminal case addresses the sabotage, not the pattern of harassment and hostile work environment that preceded it." "Exactly. Which means we need to decide whether to conclude your undercover assessment now or continue despite the changed circumstances." Kira considered the tactical options. Vaughn was currently confined to quarters, but the formal inquiry would take days or weeks. During that time, she could document how the facility responded to the incident, whether the toxic culture was addressed comprehensively or whether Vaughn's removal was treated as an isolated problem rather than a symptom of deeper issues. "I recommend we continue, at least through the initial inquiry phase," Kira said. "How the command responds to this incident will reveal a lot about institutional culture and accountability. If they treat Vaughn as a lone bad actor rather than addressing the systemic problems, we will have identified a larger failure of leadership." Reeves nodded slowly. "That is a sound tactical assessment. But you need to understand that continuing your cover may become untenable. The other trainees know you were targeted, know that Vaughn tried to destroy your career. Your position has changed from vulnerable target to someone who survived a direct attack. That may alter how people interact with you." "I understand, sir. But the mission is not complete until we understand the full scope of the problem and can recommend comprehensive solutions. Then we continue. But stay alert, Lieutenant. Vaughn is not the only one with a stake in maintaining the status quo." The facility atmosphere shifted dramatically in the days following Vaughn's detention. The trainees who had participated in or tolerated the harassment now faced an uncomfortable reality. Their behavior had been documented, witnessed, and could potentially implicate them in the broader investigation. Kira noticed the change immediately. Where before she had been ignored or actively avoided, now trainees watched her with wary calculation. Some approached with awkward apologies, claiming they had always disagreed with Vaughn's behavior but had been afraid to speak up. Others maintained their distance, but abandoned the overt hostility, uncertain about what consequences might still be coming. Isaiah was one of the few whose behavior remained consistent. He approached her during morning equipment distribution with his usual respectful manner, neither avoiding her nor treating her differently because of recent events. "How are you holding up?" he asked quietly. "I am fine, just continuing my work. People are talking, wondering what happens next. Some of the guys are worried they might be implicated in Vaughn's charges." Kira handed him his equipment checklist. "The investigation will focus on the people who committed actual crimes. Everyone else just needs to think about what kind of culture they want to be part of going forward." Isaiah nodded thoughtfully. "I think a lot of people are doing that thinking right now, realizing how bad things got without anyone really noticing or caring." That afternoon brought the first formal interview. A Naval Criminal Investigative Service agent arrived at the facility, a veteran investigator named Agent Patricia Mendoza, who carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had seen every variation of military misconduct. She requested interviews with numerous personnel, including Kira. The interview room was austere and professional. Agent Mendoza sat across from Kira with a recording device and thick file of documentation. "Specialist Bridgewater, I need to ask you about your experiences at this facility over the past several weeks." I understand you have been subjected to a pattern of harassment and intimidation by trainee Sergeant Vaughn and others. I need you to walk me through everything that happened, in as much detail as you can remember. Kira had prepared for this moment. Her cover required her to present as a victimized support specialist, someone who had endured harassment without the tactical awareness of her true identity. But her testimony also needed to provide the comprehensive documentation that would support systemic reforms. She walked Agent Mendoza through every incident, from the first dismissive comments to the physical intimidation to the sabotage attempt. She described the social isolation tactics, the deliberate disruption of her work, the public humiliation during physical training. She named witnesses, provided dates and times, and explained how the harassment had escalated methodically over weeks. Agent Mendoza took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When Kira finished, the agent sat back and studied her with professional assessment. "That is very comprehensive testimony," she said. "Most harassment victims have trouble remembering specific details because the trauma makes memory unreliable. But you have provided dates, times, witnesses, and exact quotes. That is unusual." Kira had anticipated this observation. "I kept a journal," she said. "Writing helped me process what was happening. When things got bad, I documented everything because I thought I might need to file a formal complaint eventually. Smart thinking. Those notes will be valuable evidence." The agent paused, then continued. "I need to ask you something directly. Did you at any point feel physically threatened? Did you fear that Vaughn or his associates might escalate to actual assault?" The question was tactical, establishing whether the harassment had crossed into criminal territory beyond the ammunition sabotage. Kira chose her words carefully. "Yes," she replied, "especially in the last week before the sabotage attempt. Vaughn was getting increasingly aggressive, invading my personal space, making veiled threats. I was concerned about what might happen if he cornered me somewhere without witnesses." "Did you report these concerns to anyone?" "I did not file a formal complaint, but I believe Commander Reeves was aware of the situation. He had observed some of the interactions personally." Agent Mendoza made notes, her expression thoughtful. "Over the next several days, she will interview dozens of facility personnel, building a comprehensive picture of the toxic culture that had enabled Vaughn's behavior." 3 days into the investigation, Commander Reeves convened a facility-wide meeting. Every trainee and instructor assembled in the main briefing room, the atmosphere tense with anticipation. Reeves stood at the front of the room, his bearing commanding absolute attention. "The investigation into the ammunition sabotage is ongoing," he began. "But that incident has revealed deeper problems with facility culture that need to be addressed immediately and comprehensively." He detailed the findings without naming specific individuals beyond those already under investigation. He described patterns of harassment, discrimination, and hostile work environment that have been allowed to flourish through passive acceptance and failure of leadership accountability. "This facility exists to train the finest warriors in the world," Reeves continued. "But being a warrior is not just about physical capability or tactical skill. It is about character, integrity, and the willingness to stand up for what is right, even when it is difficult or unpopular. Too many people in this facility failed that standard." The room was silent, the weight of command judgment settling over everyone present. "Effective immediately, we are implementing comprehensive culture reforms. Zero tolerance for harassment or discrimination. Mandatory leadership training on recognizing and addressing toxic behavior. Anonymous reporting mechanisms for anyone who witnesses misconduct. And most importantly, a fundamental shift in how we evaluate trainee performance. Technical skills matter, but so does character. Anyone who demonstrates the kind of behavior we have witnessed in recent weeks will be removed from training regardless of their physical abilities." Kira watched the reactions around the room. Some trainees looked relieved, others uncomfortable, a few defiant. But the message was clear. The old culture was ending, and a new standard was being established. After the briefing, several trainees approached Kira to apologize more formally. Their words varied, but the theme was consistent. They had known the harassment was wrong, but had not known how to intervene without becoming targets themselves. One trainee, a quiet operator named Corporal Jensen who had never participated in the harassment but had also never defended her, spoke with particular sincerity. "I should have said something," he admitted. "I knew what they were doing was wrong, but I told myself it was not my problem. That was cowardice, and I am sorry." Kira accepted the apology with professional grace, recognizing that these conversations were part of the cultural transformation that needed to happen. People had to acknowledge their failures before they could commit to better behavior. That evening, Isaiah found her as she was securing the depot. "The facility feels different now," he observed. "Like people are actually thinking about how they treat each other instead of just going along with whoever is loudest." "That is what accountability looks like," Kira replied. "When leadership sets clear standards and enforces them consistently, culture changes. But it has to be sustained over time. The real test is whether these reforms last or whether people slip back into old patterns once the attention fades." Isaiah considered this, his expression thoughtful. "You think differently than most people I have met here. Like you have seen this kind of thing before and know how it plays out." Kira chose her words carefully, maintaining her cover while acknowledging his perception. "I pay attention to patterns. That is part of what makes me good at logistics work. Understanding systems and how they can fail." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Agent Mendoza, who had requested another meeting with Kira. They walked to a private office where the agent had set up a temporary workspace, files and documentation covering every available surface. "I have been reviewing witness testimony," Mendoza said once they were alone. "Your account has been corroborated by multiple sources. Isaiah Grant, several other trainees who observed incidents, even some instructors who witnessed the harassment but failed to intervene. The pattern is clear and well documented." "That is good," Kira replied. "It means the investigation has solid evidence." "It does. But I need to discuss something sensitive." Agent Mendoza leaned forward, her expression serious. "Several witnesses mentioned that you handled the harassment with unusual composure, that you never seemed intimidated or frightened despite escalating threats. One instructor even commented that your demeanor during confrontations suggested professional training beyond what a junior logistics specialist would typically have." Kira felt the tactical situation shift. Her cover was being questioned by someone trained to identify deception. She needed to respond carefully, providing explanation without revealing her true identity prematurely. "I grew up in a military family," Kira said, which was actually true of her real background. "My father was career Navy, my brother served in the Marines. I learned early that showing fear to bullies just encourages them. Better to stay professional and document everything." Mendoza studied her for a long moment. "That makes sense. But I want you to know that if there is anything else relevant to this investigation, anything about your background or training that might help us understand the full picture, now is the time to share it." The invitation was clear. Agent Mendoza suspected something, but was giving Kira the opportunity to come forward voluntarily. But the decision to break cover was not Kira's alone to make. That authority rested with Commander Reeves and the command structure that had authorized her assessment mission. "I have told you everything relevant to the harassment and sabotage," Kira replied. "If there are other questions about my background, you would need to direct those through official channels." Mendoza nodded slowly, accepting the deflection but clearly not entirely satisfied. "Understood. I will continue my investigation through appropriate channels. Thank you for your cooperation." After the interview, Kira immediately contacted Commander Reeves through secure means. They met in his office that evening, the conversation brief and tactical. "Agent Mendoza is asking questions about my background," Kira reported. "She suspects there is more to my story than the official cover. Eventually, she will request my complete personnel file and discover the discrepancies." "That was always a risk with NCIS involvement," Reeves acknowledged. "The question is whether we maintain the cover through the completion of the investigation or whether we bring Mendoza into the full picture now." "What is the status of the broader assessment?" Kira asked. "We have documented comprehensive evidence of toxic culture systemic failures in leadership accountability, and the need for institutional reforms. Your mission objectives have been met. The question now is whether revealing your true identity serves the larger purpose or complicates the criminal case against Vaughn. Kira understood the complexity. If her SEAL identity became known, Vaughn's defense attorneys might argue that she was a trained operator conducting entrapment rather than a genuine victim of harassment. The criminal case could be compromised by the revelation that the supposedly vulnerable target was actually an elite warrior fully capable of defending herself. My recommendation is that we maintain the cover through the completion of the criminal proceedings, Kira said. Once Vaughn and his associates are convicted, we can reveal the assessment mission and use it to support the broader institutional reforms. That way we protect both the criminal case and the larger cultural changes. Reeves considered this, then nodded. I concur. I will coordinate with Agent Mendoza through appropriate channels, providing her enough information to satisfy her professional concerns without compromising either investigation. The following days brought a new kind of tension to the facility. The formal inquiry into Vaughn's actions moved forward with bureaucratic inevitability, testimony being gathered and evidence compiled. Polk and Farrell, facing their own charges as accomplices to the sabotage, attempted to negotiate reduced sentences by providing testimony against Vaughn. Kira observed these developments while maintaining her cover role, continuing her supply duties with the same professional competence she had demonstrated throughout the assignment. But the facility culture was genuinely changing around her. Trainees who had participated in or tolerated the harassment were now actively working to demonstrate reformed behavior, treating support personnel with respect and intervening when they witnessed disrespectful conduct. Isaiah had emerged as an informal leader among the trainees who supported the cultural reforms. He organized discussions about leadership and integrity, using his own failure to intervene earlier as an example of how passive acceptance enabled toxic behavior. One afternoon, as Kira was organizing equipment for an upcoming training exercise, a group of trainees approached, led by Corporal Jensen. They carried themselves with obvious discomfort, clearly having prepared for a difficult conversation. Specialist Bridgewater, Jensen began, "We wanted to speak with you as a group. We have all talked among ourselves about what happened, about how we let Vaughn and his crew create such a hostile environment. Some of us participated, some of us just stood by and watched. Either way, we failed you and we failed the standards we claim to uphold." The other trainees nodded, their expressions reflecting genuine remorse. One spoke up, a younger operator named Morrison who had laughed at some of Vaughn's comments early in the harassment campaign. "I made jokes about you," Morrison said. "Treated you like you were less than us because you were support and not a shooter. I did not think about you as a real person with feelings and dignity. That was wrong and I am sorry." Kira listened to each apology, recognizing the courage it took for these men to acknowledge their failures publicly. This was what genuine cultural change looked like, not just policy changes imposed from above, but personal accountability embraced from within. "I appreciate your apologies," she said when they had finished. "But the real test is not whether you feel sorry for what happened. It is whether you carry these lessons forward and create a different culture going forward. Whether you intervene the next time you see someone being treated unfairly, even if it is not convenient or popular. We will," Jensen promised. "That is a commitment we are making to each other, not just to you. We hold each other accountable from now on." The group departed, leaving Kira alone with her thoughts. The cultural transformation was real and meaningful, but she knew it existed in a fragile state. Without sustained leadership commitment and continued accountability, the old patterns could reassert themselves. Her assessment report would need to emphasize the importance of long-term institutional vigilance. 2 weeks into the investigation, the situation took an unexpected turn. Vaughn, facing overwhelming evidence and testimony from his former allies who had turned against him to save themselves, requested a meeting through his defense attorney. Agent Mendoza informed Kira that Vaughn wanted to apologize directly to her as part of a potential plea agreement. "You are under no obligation to accept this meeting," Mendoza emphasized. "In fact, I would advise against it. Vaughn's attorney is looking for anything that might mitigate his client's culpability, and face-to-face contact could be used to suggest you harbor no real grievance. Kira considered the tactical implications. A meeting with Vaughn could provide valuable psychological insight into how perpetrators of harassment justify their actions. It could also demonstrate to the facility that victims had agency and strength rather than remaining forever defined by their victimization. I will take the meeting, Kira decided, but under controlled conditions with witnesses present. The meeting was arranged in a conference room with Agent Mendoza, Vaughn's attorney, and a facility legal officer present. Vaughn entered in duty, uniform stripped of rank insignia, his bearing diminished from the arrogant confidence he had displayed weeks earlier. He looked exhausted and genuinely shaken by the consequences of his actions. Specialist Bridgewater, his attorney, began, "My client has requested this opportunity to address you directly. He understands the harm he caused and wishes to take personal responsibility for his actions." Vaughn met Kira's eyes with visible difficulty. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice lacking its former certainty. "What I did was wrong on every level. The harassment, the intimidation, the sabotage attempt. I convinced myself you did not belong here, that you were taking a spot from someone more deserving. I used that justification to treat you as less than human." He paused, clearly struggling with the words. "I was raised to believe that being a warrior meant being the toughest, the strongest, the most dominant person in any room. I thought respect had to be taken through force and intimidation. I was wrong about all of it. Real strength is about integrity and standing up for what is right, not tearing other people down to make yourself feel superior." Kira listened without interrupting, evaluating his sincerity. The apology felt genuine rather than purely tactical, suggesting that facing consequences had genuinely shaken his worldview. But words were cheap compared to sustained behavioral change. "Why did you target me specifically?" Kira asked. "There are other support personnel at this facility. What made me different?" Vaughn hesitated, then answered with painful honesty. "Because you would not break. Every time I tried to intimidate you, you stayed professional and composed. That threatened me because it meant my tactics were not working. So I kept escalating, trying to find your breaking point. I was so focused on dominating you that I lost sight of basic human decency. And the sabotage attempt? That was desperation. When nothing else worked, when you would not quit or give me ammunition to get you reassigned through official channels, I convinced myself that framing you was justified, that the ends justified the means. I was completely wrong, and I have destroyed my own career because of my stupidity and cruelty." The attorney interjected carefully. "My client understands that his apology does not undo the harm he caused. He is prepared to accept full responsibility in court and is hoping only that this acknowledgement might provide some measure of closure." Kira studied Vaughn for a long moment, then spoke with deliberate clarity. "I accept your apology for what it is, an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. But acceptance does not mean forgiveness, and it certainly does not mean those actions should carry reduced consequences. You made choices that harmed not just me, but the entire culture of this facility. Other people suffered because you created an environment where harassment was normalized and tolerated." Vaughn nodded, accepting the judgment. "I understand. I deserve whatever punishment the court decides. What I want from you," Kira continued, "is a commitment that if you ever have the opportunity to serve in any capacity again, you remember this lesson and use it to build people up instead of tearing them down. That you speak up when you see others being harassed or discriminated against. That you recognize strength comes from integrity, not domination." "I promise," Vaughn said quietly. "For whatever that is worth coming from me now, I promise." The meeting concluded shortly after. As Vaughn was escorted out, Agent Mendoza turned to Kira with professional respect. "That was well handled. You gave him accountability without letting him off the hook. Not many people could maintain that kind of composure facing someone who tried to destroy their career." "I have had practice dealing with difficult people," Kira replied, maintaining her cover even as the mission approached its conclusion. That evening, Commander Reeves summoned her for another private meeting. "The criminal case is moving toward resolution," he reported. Vaughn will plead guilty to sabotage and harassment charges. Polk and Farrell are accepting lesser charges in exchange for testimony. All three will be discharged from service with appropriate marks on their records. In the broader cultural assessment, Kira asked, "Your documentation has been comprehensive and devastating. We have identified systemic failures at multiple levels of leadership, passive acceptance of toxic behavior by instructors who should have intervened, and inadequate mechanisms for reporting and addressing harassment. The reforms we have implemented are just the beginning. This facility will serve as a pilot program for cultural changes across naval special warfare." Then the mission was successful. Reeves met her eyes with the directness of a fellow operator. "More than successful, Lieutenant. You endured weeks of escalating harassment without breaking character, documented everything with precision, and provided the evidence needed to implement lasting institutional change. That took a different kind of courage than combat operations, but courage nonetheless. What happens next, sir? We maintain your cover through the completion of Vaughn's sentencing. Once that is finalized, we reveal the assessment mission to facility personnel and use your experience as a case study in recognizing and addressing toxic culture. Your real identity and rank will be disclosed, and you will brief leadership on your findings and recommendations." Kira felt a mix of relief and anticipation. The mission was nearly complete, but the revelation of her true identity would transform how everyone at the facility understood the past weeks. The support specialist they had harassed or defended or ignored would be revealed as a SEAL operator who had been evaluating them all along. The sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks after Vaughn's guilty plea. The military courtroom was filled with facility personnel who had been affected by the case, either as witnesses or as members of the community forced to confront their own complicity in toxic culture. Kira sat in the front row, her presence both as victim and as representative of the systemic problems that had allowed the harassment to flourish. The military judge was a career officer with decades of experience, someone who had seen every variation of military misconduct. She reviewed the evidence methodically, detailing each incident of harassment, each act of intimidation, and finally the sabotage attempt that had brought criminal charges. Trainee Sergeant Derek Vaughn, the judge said, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority, "You have pleaded guilty to charges of harassment, creating a hostile work environment, sabotage of military property, and conspiracy to file false official statements. The evidence presented demonstrates a sustained campaign of psychological warfare against a fellow service member who was simply trying to do her job with professionalism and integrity." Vaughn stood at attention before the bench, his posture military correct, but his expression showing the weight of his choices. "Your actions did not occur in isolation," the judge continued. "You created and led a culture of discrimination and intimidation that affected not just your direct victim, but the entire facility. Other service members felt compelled to participate in or tolerate your behavior out of fear of becoming targets themselves. You corrupted the very values that naval special warfare is supposed to represent." The judge detailed the sentence: dishonorable discharge, reduction to the lowest enlisted rank, forfeiture of all pay and benefits, and 6 months confinement. Polk and Farrell received similar but slightly reduced sentences, their cooperation with the investigation earning them marginal consideration. As the court adjourned, Kira felt the finality of the moment. The criminal case was concluded, justice served within the framework of military law. But she knew that true accountability required more than punishment of individuals. It required institutional transformation that addressed the systemic problems that had enabled the toxic culture. That evening, Commander Reeves convened a facility-wide assembly. Every trainee, instructor, and support staff member filled the briefing room, the atmosphere electric with anticipation. Rumors had been circulating for days that something significant was about to be revealed, something that would reframe everything they thought they understood about recent events. Reeves stood at the front of the room with Kira beside him, her uniform still displaying the rank insignia of a junior logistics specialist. Agent Mendoza was also present, positioned at the side of the room with an expression of professional interest. Today marks the conclusion of 2 investigations, Reeves began. The criminal case against former trainee Sergeant Vaughn and his associates, and a classified assessment mission that has been ongoing for the past 2 months. Both investigations are now complete, and it is time to share the full truth with this facility. He gestured toward Kira. Many of you know Specialist Bridgewater as a logistics support staff member who was targeted for harassment and ultimately subjected to criminal sabotage. What you do not know is that Specialist Bridgewater is not who she appeared to be. The room held its collective breath as Reeves continued. Her real name is Lieutenant Kira Bridgewater. She is an active-duty Navy SEAL with 6 years of operational experience, including deployments in 3 combat theaters. She holds commendations for valor and has completed specialized training in tactical assessment and undercover operations. The silence in the room was absolute, shock rippling through the assembled personnel as they processed the revelation. Isaiah's eyes widened in recognition and something like vindication. Others looked stunned, their understanding of recent events fragmenting and reforming around this new information. Lieutenant Bridgewater was assigned to this facility on a classified mission to assess unit culture and document patterns of harassment and discrimination, Reeves explained. She assumed the cover identity of a junior support specialist specifically to present as vulnerable and observe how facility personnel treated someone they perceived as inferior or unworthy of respect. Kira stepped forward, her demeanor transforming as she allowed her true bearing to show through. The composed but somewhat passive logistics specialist disappeared, replaced by the confidence and command presence of an elite operator. For 8 weeks, she said, her voice carrying natural authority, I documented everything I observed at this facility. The harassment I personally experienced from Vaughn and his associates. The passive acceptance by instructors who witnessed misconduct but failed to intervene. The social pressure that silenced people who wanted to speak up but feared becoming targets themselves. The systemic failures that allowed toxic culture to flourish unchecked. She paused, letting her words settle. I want to be clear about something. I am a trained SEAL operator. I have faced enemy combatants in actual warfare. I could have ended Vaughn's harassment campaign at any point with minimal effort. But that was not the mission. The mission was to document what happens when someone appears vulnerable, to understand how toxic culture manifests and spreads, and to identify the institutional changes needed to prevent this from happening to people who do not have my training or capability. The implications cascaded through the room. Every interaction, every moment of harassment or defense or passive observation had been witnessed and evaluated by someone who was assessing them the entire time. Some of you participated in the harassment, Kira continued. You made dismissive comments, disrupted my work, or actively contributed to creating a hostile environment. Others stood by and watched, knowing it was wrong, but choosing not to intervene. A few, like trainee Corporal Grant, demonstrated integrity by treating me with basic respect even when it was socially risky to do so. Isaiah straightened slightly, recognition of his character becoming public knowledge. This assessment was not about punishing individuals, Kira explained. It was about understanding systems. Vaughn and his associates faced criminal charges because they crossed legal lines. But the broader problem was cultural, and fixing it requires everyone in this room to examine their own behavior and commit to higher standards. Commander Reeves stepped forward again. The reforms we have implemented are based directly on Lieutenant Bridgewater's findings and recommendations. Zero-tolerance policies, enhanced reporting mechanisms, leadership accountability measures. But policies only work if the people in the organization embrace them and hold each other accountable. He looked around the room, meeting eyes with deliberate intensity. Some of you are wondering if you will face consequences for your behavior during the assessment period. The answer is that we are focused on forward progress rather than retroactive punishment, with one exception. Any instructor or leadership personnel who witnessed harassment and failed to intervene will undergo remedial training and will be evaluated closely going forward. We cannot have leaders who tolerate or ignore toxic behavior. The briefing continued for another hour, with questions from facility personnel and detailed explanation of the new policies and cultural expectations. When it finally concluded, the room emptied slowly, personnel processing the revelation and its implications for their own understanding of recent events. Isaiah approached Kira as the crowd dispersed, his expression a mix of emotions. "I knew something was different about you," he said. "The way you handled everything, the composure under pressure. But I never imagined this." "You demonstrated real integrity," Kira replied, standing up for what was right even when it carried personal risk. "That is the kind of character we need in the SEAL community." "Thank you," Isaiah replied. "But I should have done more. Should have spoken up louder, pushed back harder against the toxic behavior." "You did what you could within your position and experience level," Kira said. "That matters. The question now is what you do with the lessons learned going forward." Over the following days, the facility underwent a transformation that went beyond policy changes. Personnel who had participated in or tolerated the harassment sought out Kira for private conversations, trying to understand how their behavior appeared through her assessment lens. Some apologized again, with deeper understanding now that they knew her true capabilities. Others asked for guidance on how to recognize and address toxic behavior in the future. Corporal Jensen approached her during a training evolution, his manner respectful but determined. "Lieutenant, I need to ask you something. When you were in your cover role and I failed to intervene when Vaughn was harassing you, what were you thinking? How did it feel to know that people who should have helped you were just standing by?" Kira considered the question carefully. Disappointed, but not surprised, she replied honestly. "Most people avoid conflict when they can, especially when intervening carries personal risk. But that is exactly why toxic cultures flourish, because good people calculate that staying silent is safer than speaking up. The courage to intervene, to say this is wrong, even when it is uncomfortable, that is what separates true leaders from people who just go along with whoever is loudest." Jensen absorbed this, his expression showing the weight of the lesson. "I will not make that mistake again. When I see something wrong, I will address it immediately, regardless of the social cost." "That is all anyone can ask," Kira said. "Learn from the experience and become better." Agent Mendoza requested a final meeting before she concluded her investigation and returned to her regular duties. They met in the same conference room where Vaughn had offered his apology, the space now carrying different emotional weight. "I have to admit," Mendoza began with a slight smile, "you had me fooled. I suspected there was something unusual about your background, but I assumed maybe prior service or specialized training, not that you were an active SEAL conducting an assessment operation." "That was the intention," Kira replied. "If the cover was too easily penetrated, it would not have served the mission purpose." "Well, you are either an exceptional actress or you genuinely experienced the emotional impact of the harassment despite knowing it was temporary and part of an assignment. Your testimony showed real trauma responses." "The harassment was real," Kira said quietly. "Knowing it was part of a mission did not make it easier to endure. Every dismissive comment, every act of intimidation, every moment of social isolation, those affected me even though I understood the tactical purpose. That is something I did not fully anticipate when I accepted the assignment." Mendoza nodded with professional understanding. "That is an important acknowledgement. Too often we assume that trained operators are immune to psychological impact, but experiencing sustained harassment takes a toll regardless of preparation or capability. The investigation has been valuable beyond a criminal case," Mendoza continued. "Your documentation provided insight into how harassment manifests and escalates in military environments. I will be recommending that your findings be incorporated into investigator training across all services." The following week brought a series of briefings where Kira presented her comprehensive assessment to Naval Special Warfare leadership. Senior officers from multiple commands attended, recognizing that the problems identified at this facility likely existed throughout the organization. She walked them through the patterns she had observed, using specific incidents to illustrate broader systemic issues. The failure of bystander intervention. The social pressure that silenced potential allies. The way harassers tested boundaries incrementally before escalating to more serious misconduct. The inadequacy of existing reporting mechanisms that required victims to navigate command structures often controlled by the same people who tolerated the harassment. Her recommendations were comprehensive and specific. Mandatory bystander intervention training. Anonymous reporting systems with guaranteed investigation. Leadership evaluation criteria that included cultural stewardship alongside tactical performance. Regular climate assessments conducted by outside evaluators. And most importantly, visible consequences for leaders who tolerated or ignored toxic behavior within their commands. The senior leadership asked difficult questions, pushing back on recommendations that would require significant resource investment or cultural change. But Kira had documented everything thoroughly, and her evidence was irrefutable. By the end of the briefing series, she had secured commitment for implementation of her recommendations across naval special warfare. Commander Reeves hosted a small gathering in her honor as the assignment approached its conclusion. Isaiah attended, along with several instructors who had supported the cultural reforms and Agent Mendoza, who had traveled back to participate. Lieutenant Bridgewater demonstrated something important, Reeves said, raising a glass in toast. That courage takes many forms. We celebrate physical bravery in combat, and rightly so, but it also takes courage to endure sustained psychological attack without retaliating, to maintain professional composure when every instinct demands response, to trust the mission even when it requires personal sacrifice. The gathering offered Kira the rare opportunity to be fully herself, not maintaining a cover or playing a role, but simply existing as the operator she truly was. She shared stories from her career with people who understood the context, the brotherhood and sisterhood of the SEAL community that transcended the toxic elements she had been documenting. Isaiah approached her privately during the gathering, his expression serious. I have been thinking a lot about what happened, what I learned, about how I want to lead when I finish training and join the teams. I want to create the kind of culture where someone like you would not need to go undercover to identify problems because we would be addressing them ourselves proactively. That is exactly the right mindset, Kira replied. Culture is not something that exists separate from the people in an organization. It is created daily through choices about how we treat each other and what behaviors we tolerate or challenge. Will you stay in touch? Isaiah asked. I mean, if that is allowed, given your operational security and everything. I think that can be arranged, Kira said with a slight smile. You have the potential to be an exceptional leader, Isaiah. The kind who makes everyone around them better. I would like to see how your career develops. The final day at the facility arrived with surprising emotional weight. Kira had spent 8 weeks in a role she had found more challenging than combat deployments, enduring harassment that had affected her more deeply than she had anticipated. But she had also witnessed genuine transformation, seen people examine their behavior and commit to higher standards. She walked through the supply depot one last time, remembering the person she had pretended to be in this space. The vulnerable logistics specialist who had absorbed harassment while documenting everything. That person had been a necessary creation, a tactical tool in service of a larger mission. But there had been truth in that role too, vulnerability and hurt that Kira had allowed herself to feel in order to understand what genuine victims experienced. Commander Reeves found her in the depot, observing quietly as she completed her final inventory. Ready to return to your team, Lieutenant? More than ready, sir. But I will carry lessons from this assignment with me. Understanding what our people face when they are targeted or marginalized, that changes how I will lead going forward. That is exactly why we chose you for this mission. You had the tactical skills to maintain cover and the emotional intelligence to understand the deeper implications. Not every operator could have done what you did. They walked together across the facility grounds one final time, the morning sun casting long shadows across training areas where future SEALs would learn their craft. The facility looked the same physically, but Kira knew that fundamental changes had taken root in ways that would shape its culture for years to come. The final formation assembled to mark her departure. Not a large ceremony, just the personnel who had been most directly involved in the events of recent months. Isaiah stood at attention with the other trainees, his bearing reflecting the leadership potential Kira had recognized. Agent Mendoza had returned for the occasion, representing the investigative community that would carry forward the lessons learned. Commander Reeves addressed the formation with characteristic brevity. Lieutenant Bridgewater came to this facility under difficult circumstances, accepting an assignment that required her to endure treatment that no service member should have to face. She did so with professionalism, courage, and unwavering commitment to improving our community. The changes we have implemented because of her work will benefit every person who serves in Naval Special Warfare. He turned to Kira. Lieutenant, you have completed your mission with distinction. Your findings and recommendations are already being implemented across the force. You have made us better, made us examine ourselves honestly, and given us the tools to create the culture we claim to value. Thank you for your service and your sacrifice. Kira stepped forward, addressing the formation for the final time. When I accepted this assignment, I thought I understood what I was getting into. I had faced enemy combatants, operated in hostile environments, dealt with physical danger. But this mission taught me that psychological warfare can be just as difficult, that sustained harassment takes a toll even when you understand it is temporary. She looked around at the assembled faces, seeing the impact of her words. To those of you who participated in the harassment before you knew my true identity, I want you to understand something important. Your behavior was wrong not because I was secretly a SEAL operator, but because I was a human being trying to do my job. The rank someone holds or the capabilities they possess should not determine whether they deserve basic respect and dignity. Isaiah and several others nodded, absorbing the lesson. To those who demonstrated integrity by treating me with respect, even when it was socially risky, you represent the best of what this community should be. You showed that courage is not just about physical bravery, but about standing up for what is right regardless of personal cost. Kira paused, gathering her final thoughts. The culture we create in our organizations is a choice. Every day, through hundreds of small decisions about how we treat each other and what behaviors we tolerate, we either build something worthy of respect or we tear it down. I challenge each of you to make those choices consciously, to be the kind of leader who makes everyone around them better. The formation came to attention as Kira prepared to depart. But before she could leave, Isaiah stepped forward, his voice clear and steady. Lieutenant Bridgewater, on behalf of the trainees who witnessed what happened and learned from it, I want to make a commitment. We will carry forward the lessons you taught us. We will create teams where everyone is treated with dignity regardless of their position. We will intervene when we see harassment or discrimination. We will build the culture that honors the values we claim to hold. That is our promise to you and to ourselves. Other trainees voiced their agreement, the commitment spreading through the formation. Kira felt the weight of the moment, recognizing that genuine transformation was taking root. The mission had succeeded not just in documenting problems, but in catalyzing real change. She departed the facility in a staff vehicle that would take her back to her regular SEAL team assignment. As the training compound disappeared behind her, Kira reflected on everything the mission had revealed about military culture, about human behavior under pressure, about the different forms that courage could take. Her team was conducting training exercises when she arrived, the familiar sounds of live fire drills and tactical communications filling the air. Her teammates welcomed her back with the casual professionalism of operators who had deployed together multiple times. They knew she had been on a classified assignment, but did not ask for details beyond what she offered. The team commander, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Blackstone, pulled her aside for a private briefing. Your assessment report has already generated significant command interest, she said. Naval Special Warfare leadership is implementing your recommendations across multiple commands. This is going to have lasting impact. That was the goal, Kira replied. Make it harder for toxic culture to take root, easier for good people to speak up when they see problems. "You did good work," Blackstone said. "Different than kinetic operations, but no less important. Maybe more important in the long run." Over the following weeks, Kira reintegrated into her team's operational rhythm. Physical training, weapons qualifications, mission planning, the familiar routines that define SEAL life. But she carried the lessons from her assessment mission into everything she did, particularly in how she interacted with support personnel and junior operators. When a new logistics coordinator joined the team, Kira made a point of introducing herself personally and ensuring the coordinator felt welcomed and valued. When she overheard dismissive comments about non-combat personnel, she challenged them immediately and directly. The small acts of cultural stewardship that prevented toxic patterns from establishing themselves. 3 months after completing her assessment mission, Kira received a message from Isaiah. He had successfully completed SEAL training and was joining his first operational team. The message was brief but meaningful, thanking her for the example she had set and confirming his commitment to creating positive culture within his new command. She replied with congratulations and advice drawn from her own experience, the beginning of a mentorship relationship that would continue throughout both their careers. Isaiah represented the future of the SEAL community, operators who understood that true strength included integrity, compassion, and the courage to stand up for what was right. Commander Reeves sent periodic updates on the facility's progress. The cultural reforms were being sustained and expanded. New trainees entered an environment fundamentally different from what had existed during Vaughn's time. Anonymous reporting was being used effectively to address problems early before they escalated. Leadership accountability was genuine rather than performative. If this story resonated with you, drop a comment about your favorite moment, or share if you have witnessed someone demonstrate unexpected strength when facing unfair treatment. Your experiences and reflections help build communities where everyone is treated with the dignity they deserve. Kira kept a copy of her assessment report in her personal files, a reminder of the mission that had challenged her in ways combat never had. The physical scars from deployments healed over time, but the emotional impact of sustained harassment had left marks that required conscious processing and recovery. She spoke about her experience at leadership conferences, helping other commands understand how to recognize and address toxic culture before it became entrenched. Her insights were valued because they came from direct experience, from someone who had endured harassment while maintaining the perspective to analyze it objectively. Years later, when Kira advanced to senior leadership positions herself, she carried the lessons forward into every command decision. She built teams where people were valued for their contributions rather than judged by superficial characteristics. She created environments where speaking up against misconduct was celebrated rather than punished. She demonstrated that true warrior culture included protecting the vulnerable and holding the powerful accountable. The mission had ended, but its impact continued rippling outward through naval special warfare and beyond. Cultural change was slow and required sustained commitment, but Kira had proven that one person willing to endure temporary hardship could catalyze transformation that benefited thousands. That was a different kind of victory than combat success, but no less meaningful in building the military community that America deserved.